This is interesting. This day in history, August 4th, 1987. The Federal Communications Commission abolished the Fairness Doctrine. It is fascinating. So some people think the Fairness Doctrine is still in play. In the 1950s, when television was invented and distributed, the government got involved. But there's only 4 real channels. There were the 3 networks, and then there was PBS. Okay? And the government said to these new networks, you got to be fair. You got to balance your presentations. Whether it's news or commentary or whatever it may be, you've got to have a fairness doctrine. If you don't, we're going to fine you a lot of money. Well, that carried through for about 30 years. But then in 1959, all right, the Communications Act was signed and it upped it. It upped it. So now there was an investigative agency if a network, leaned right or left. They were unfair. Now that was serious. But then in the late 1960s, with the Vietnam stuff, it really started to get out of control on talk radio. So in 1960, there were only 2 talk stations in the United States. 2. All right? By 1995, there were 1,200. Once talk radio started, the Fairness Doctrine went out the window. So Rush Limbaugh, for example, he began in the early 90s. By 94, he had 20 million Americans tuning in to hear a conservative point of view. There was no balance. It was Mr. Limbaugh's show, and for 3 hours, he espoused conservative tenets. And the government didn't bother him. But the government had a problem. It had to abolish the Fairness Doctrine because of the rise of talk radio. The network news stayed fairly pliant until Dan Rather took over from Walter Cronkite. Okay? So Walter Cronkite was a liberal, but he hid it. But once Rather took over, Rather was a real rabid liberal, is to this day. Then it started to change. And I was there. I worked for Rather. I saw it. Now, Brokaw is much more subtle. Okay? Jennings was liberal, but very disciplined. Sometimes his bias would come out, but not a lot. So Jennings and Brokaw, they didn't traffic in that too much. Rather did. And then the government had to abolish the Fairness Doctrine. It was just too much going on, and they did it 34 years ago today. Isn't that a fascinating history story? I think it is.